One of the UN's most controversial peacekeeping missions is about to end. Troops in Haiti have been accused of harming the very people they were sent to protect through sexual abuse and a massive cholera outbreak. Now, for many people, it is a toxic legacy, as our Latin America correspondent Annalise Borges reports.
Haiti will soon bid farewell to one of its most controversial guests. Peacekeepers with the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti are pulling out after 13 years in the country. We tagged along the Brazilian military wing of MINUSTA on the last few days of their deployment to Haiti, a mission they consider a success.
We accomplished our mission. The soldiers did a beautiful job, a tremendous job. MINUSTA, it's a case of success in the UN history.
And that positive assessment was shared by the UN Security Council, which decided to pull these troops out of Haiti, deeming the country safe enough. But can this nation maintain peace and stability on its own? Not everyone here is convinced.
This was the scene in the streets of Haiti in 2004. Armed men in the small port town of Gonaïves started what was said to be the beginning of another bloody fight for power in the small Caribbean nation. The former French colony's history had been marked by armed conflicts and political instability, and now Haiti was edging ever so close to civil war. MINUSTA was sent to restore order in 6 months. 13 years on, this is the scene they are leaving behind. Protesters clashed with security forces when anti-government demonstrations turned violent last week. After a turbulent electoral process, which was monitored by the UN and lasted over 18 months, these Haitians now say they want a revolution. The story of MINUSTA is one of controversies. Shortly after the devastating earthquake in 2010, a deadly cholera epidemic hit Haiti. The disease, which killed over 10,000 people and sickened hundreds of thousands, was traced back to Nepalese peacekeepers. But there was more. A report published in January this year revealed hundreds of women and children were raped by UN peacekeepers in Haiti. Over 200 women and minors say they were abused in, quote, transactional sex incidents in exchange for food and medicine.
To me, in any other country, this catalog of offenses would have had them run out and pay compensation, but apparently in Haiti, it's okay for us, and that's not okay at all.
On October 15, MINUSTA will come to an end. There are different views on what the mission has accomplished in Haiti, but it's clear they leave behind a complex legacy, one that offers the UN some hard lessons for the future. Annalise Borges, TRT World, Port-au-Prince, Haiti.
Plenty of questions then about the UN's role in Haiti. Annalise has been putting them to the head of the mission there.
Haiti today is a different place from where the country was in 2004 when the mission was established. The country, in the time that MINUSTA has served, has been able to organize electoral processes and hand over from one democratically elected president to another. President who assumed office in February of 2017, President Jovenel Moïse, and his administration and government have indicated their plans for further development of the country. So I would say that, yes, MINUSTA has been able to contribute to that stabilization, has been able to contribute to the professionalization of the Haitian National Police, which is a work that is in train. The police are developing further.
I would like to ask you about the allegations of sexual exploitation that some of the locals have made against UN peacekeeping troops. Has there been an investigation, a thorough investigation into those accusations, and what were some of the findings?
Every allegation of sexual abuse and exploitation that we receive is treated in a very serious manner in keeping with the guidelines and the procedures outlined by the United Nations headquarters. In instances where these allegations involved uniformed personnel, the countries concerned, and to request that the sanctions that are applicable are applied to the persons who are found to be responsible for such acts. We have, in the past, when we have had allegations, we have attempted to support the victims through, for example, provision of employment in some cases, and also pursuing actively through our headquarters with the countries of origin of the perpetrators to ensure that justice is done, and to ensure that in the case, for instance, where there are children born of such cases, that there is provision made for these children.
Mrs. Sandra Honoré, this UN Special Representative here in Haiti, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Driving through change will, of course, take strong leadership. At the UN, the top job is held by Antonio Guterres. Here's our profile of the man in charge.
Hello. Antonio Guterres is a veteran diplomat, a former Prime Minister of Portugal,
solemnly swear
and since January, the most powerful man at the United Nations. Chosen as Secretary General in the most transparent election in the UN's history, it's his job to make sure that the organization stays relevant, and he says that cannot happen without change.
We need to have a strong commitment to reform multilateral organizations, and one of those is the UN. And so I do believe that it is absolutely essential to introduce a very solid program of reforms.
His first 9 months have taken him to a number of different countries, notably to the Gulf to mediate in a dispute between regional powers, and to Israel, where he spoke out against the occupation of Palestinian land. After the violence involving white supremacists in the US, Guterres called on the world to stand up against racism, a remark seen as a veiled criticism of US President Donald Trump. Ultimately, however, Guterres will be judged not just by his words, but by how much meaningful change he can achieve in the organization he leads.
With the election of Guterres almost 9 months ago, there was much excitement, hope, and anticipation here at the United Nations and around the world that he would be the person to fill the leadership vacuum that we have in the world today, that he would effectively restore the central moral authority of the United Nations. But I think it is fair to say that almost 9 months on, much of that enthusiasm has died down. I had the chance to catch up with his spokesman a little earlier, Stéphane Dujarric, and I asked him how effective Antonio Guterres can be if he doesn't speak up more forcefully on some of the key issues.
I think, first of all, he has spoken up. He has spoken up on issues of principle, on key issues, whether it's refugees or migrants, whether it's the rise of xenophobia, whether it's issues relating to climate change. He has been very strong, has spoken out very clearly. I also think the United Nations its advantage, in fact, is in its multiplicity of voices. We have an excellent High Commissioner for Human Rights who has been very vocal, and frankly, the Secretary General has supported him in everything that he said.
But he precisely, and you're talking about the High Commissioner for Human Rights, he has taken the lead when many people look to the Secretary General of the UN to speak up for people whose rights are being trampled on. So on the Rohingya issue, we've noticed that in the last few days, he's stepped up the rhetoric. But he wasn't the first to do so, as I say. He didn't take the lead. But on issues like Yemen, on what's going on there with the number of civilians dying every day. Why don't we hear him speak out more clearly and more forcefully?
I think if you looked at the statement that he's issued, and even what was said, you will see that we have clearly and continuously condemned the killing of civilians, the bombings that have been done by the Saudi-led coalition. Later this month,
you've never been explicit in your condemnation.
I think we have been explicit. I mean, I speak for him every day. I think I've been fairly explicit. Later this next couple of weeks, he will be issuing his report on children in armed conflict, which I think will be very telling and very explicit on the situation, especially the situation in Yemen.
Well, speaking about this report, Children and Armed Conflict, this has been a controversial report over the last couple of years. Ban Ki-moon, Guterres' predecessor, we know, was subjected to some quite significant pressure from Israel and the Saudi-led coalition waging war in Yemen because of an annex, a blacklist,
a list
of countries and entities that have been accused of targeting children in the context of war. Now I understand that Antonio Guterres wants to do away with this list. Of course, it's a headache for any Secretary General. Is that true? And it is my understanding that this report is put on hold. Are we to infer from this that
I think the basic premise of your question, if I may, is wrong. The report is not put on hold. It's scheduled for discussion in the Security Council the start of October. It will go to Council members by the end of this month, of September. The report is not yet finalized. The Secretary General will make the ultimate decision. It will have an annex. It will have a list. And I have full trust that he will make the right decision. But I think
that's what a lot of people are hoping, because they've already seen worrying signs where he's caved in, to put it bluntly.
I don't think he's caved in. I don't think he's caved in.
I just want to draw your attention back to March, where it is a known fact now. He put a lot of pressure on a senior UN official to withdraw a report criticizing Israel in its policy toward the Palestinians. She says, and we all understand, was ordered by Antonio Guterres to withdraw the report. When she refused to do so, she resigned.
I think the report had not gone through the proper clearance channel. And for the Secretary General, it was a question of his own authority, of reports being issued in his name that did not reflect his views and that did not go through the proper clearance channels.
I think if you look
at the report, but I think if you look at the reports that he's shown that has been issued since,
he has caved into pressure, and that he isn't willing to stand up. To some powerful nations.
I think the problem is that people look at the Secretary General, his activities, through their own lens. Other sides to this argument have said that there have been too many reports from the Secretary General being critical. I think the Secretary General issues reports in his name that he is comfortable with, that reflect his position. And I think any honest look at all the reports that have been issued on the Israeli-Palestine issue since he came into office, I think will bear up to that. He has not, any Secretary General comes under pressure from many sides, from many countries. That's the difficult role of a Secretary General, someone who faces high expectation, but has in fact very little authority if you look at the charter.
And much of that pressure, in fact, we all know comes from one specific country, and that is the United States. It seems to me that Antonio Guterres has so far tried a policy of appeasement toward the Trump administration. Do you think it's paid off so far?
No, listen, I think I would urge you to look back at the long speech he gave on climate change and the importance of U.S. involvement in the Paris Agreement, which I think he made clear that his position is not that of the United States. But the United States is also the United Nations' largest contributor. It is key for any Secretary General, and it is key for him, for Antonio Guterres, to be involved and to be in dialogue and in constructive dialogue with the United States. And I think he has.
So we've heard some of the criticisms of the UN so far, but it's had some major achievements too. James Champion has our 5 facts.
UN programs have improved lives across the world. More than 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty since 1990. Children's Fund UNICEF says the lives of more than 90 million children have been saved in the same period. Millions more are alive today thanks to immunisation and education about disease. New HIV infections were cut by nearly 40% between 2000 and 2016. But achievements like these don't come cheap. Total UN spending, that comes to more than $40 billion a year. And the 2030 agenda, the UN's plan to hit targets in education, health, inequality, the environment and more, well, reaching them would take an estimated $3 trillion per year.
Well, we can now bring in our guests. Shireen Tadros is Amnesty International's UN Director and a former international correspondent. And Ashish Pradhan is from the International Crisis Group. Thanks to you both for being here. Shireen, of course, the Secretary General doesn't have an easy job. He's got countless humanitarian crises around the world, conflicts to deal with, and now a US administration that's bent on an isolationist, America First policy. Has Antonio Guterres, though, done enough to give this organization the right voice and the right vision?
I mean, you're right. It's known as one of the hardest jobs in the world, if not the hardest job in the world. And don't forget, there were huge expectations for Antonio Guterres. He came in at a time when we were having this sort of right-wing movement across the world, and leaders coming in that we were palpitating over, you know, what could happen. And then you have Antonio Guterres coming in, and everyone going, phew. So the bar was quite high for him. Has he performed? I think the consensus amongst the NGO community is that he could have done a lot more. There is a certain degree of frustration over the soft diplomacy that he has chosen to do, these sort of closed door meetings, give me time, let me negotiate behind closed doors, that at the end of the day we're seeing crisis all over the world.
Ashish, it's precisely what he says. He might be more effective in doing this diplomacy, quiet diplomacy from behind the scenes, but can he be really effective as a leader if he doesn't speak up more publicly and more forcefully on certain issues?
Certainly, I think striking the balance between that type of closed-door diplomacy and the public statements is something I think that he can improve on. I think even on the, to go back to what Shireen said, even on the private diplomacy, we've seen room for improvement. I think he came out at the start of the year making prevention a big plank of his and getting out there and trying to, you know, address crises before they escalate. I know South Sudan was an example that he really emphasized, and he initially engaged with the region, with the African Union, and there were some signs of promise. But ultimately, I think that's fizzled out a bit. I think what we hear in-house now is that the 38th floor, where the Secretary General works, doesn't really discuss these types of crises as much as they should. You know, he has a prevention agenda, but that hasn't really panned out yet.
And of course, he's someone who's highly qualified to do the job, having been Prime Minister of Portugal. He is said to keep his cards quite close to his chest and make many of the key decisions by himself or with a very small group of inner circle around him. But I wonder, when it comes to the geographic representation in the building behind us, on the 38th floor, but also around the United Nations as a whole, he hasn't started with a clean slate, in that he has allowed the P5 countries and a lot of Western countries to keep a very tight grip on some of the key departments within the UN. Should he have changed this tradition?
He's making that a point right now, and especially with the gender parity issue. So he's brought on a lot of women in key positions, and we already can see the effects of that. So actually, I would say that that's an area of Guterres' reform that we are actually seeing some traction on.
Gender parity, though, but not geographic representation, which is a key principle enshrined in the UN Charter itself. Would you like to see him do more? Because we often say how the Security Council is not representative of the rest of the world, but should the Secretariat be as well?
Absolutely, but we all know that, especially when it comes to the key departments of the UN, it's very, very difficult to negotiate this with the P5. In fact, before Guterres was even in his position, a lot of these those changeovers in the main departments, like Department of Political Affairs and also peacekeeping, this was a done deal. So how much room for maneuver does the Secretary General have? And does that mean that we need larger reform so that the P5 don't have this sort of power over these key positions?
You mentioned peacekeeping. Ashish, what are your thoughts about the future of peacekeeping? We know that the Haiti mission is wrapping up, a mission that's been mired in controversy, but peacekeeping in general, also in all fairness, has been one of the success stories, despite the controversies, for the United Nations.
I think that's an area, despite what you said, there are areas that have had success in peacekeeping. There's a lot of reform that should happen. I think there's been a lot written, a lot of reviews that have taken place over the years about right-sizing peacekeeping, about making troops that are peacekeepers perform better. And I think that's been a big part of the US push for peacekeeping reform. And I think the Secretary General has managed to work with them as much as possible. But I think one thing that we've looked at in the last couple of months, including with the Democratic Republic of Congo mission, is how you go about that reform is just as important. It's all good and well to say you'll put the politics first, but the possibility of signaling disengagement when you have a downsizing of troops at a vulnerable time in a country's political situation can mean that you ultimately sort of end up diminishing your influence, having less chips to play in terms of the politics, and then ultimately not being able to really change much about the conflict. So I think, again, reform is important. How you go about that is just as important, and we need to see more from that on the UN side, but also on the Security Council side from the major powers.
How much more engagement, Shireen, do we want to see from the rest of the world? I mean, we've been talking about how the US administration seems to be in retreat on the international stage. Antonio Guterres says the world needs the US to be more engaged, but could it be actually a good thing for the US to be less engaged in many parts of the world?
I think it really depends on where we're talking about in the world. I mean, if our bar is, the Trump administration's policy towards X and Y country being so bad that it's better that they just, release completely, then yeah, sometimes that is a better option. But what we found here is that the absence of the US position on certain countries has made it very difficult for the rest of the membership to react, and it's left the UN unbalanced. I mean, this is a very difficult ship to steer, and sometimes it feels like the Secretary General is just trying to keep it afloat rather than steering it. And that is a large part down to the US and their position. They are extremely powerful in this building.
And if the US does retreat, I mean, could we see another player jump in? China, for example.
I think
when it comes to climate change, they have shown that they were willing to take the lead.
Certainly, on issues like climate change they have, but on other issues, I think a lot of people hoped on November 9th of 2016 that maybe with the possibility of a Trump administration, others like China can step in. I think they're not quite as ready as others would like them to be. They're doing a bit more peacekeeping, committing more troops. But I think they're largely not as willing and not as ready as others would like it to be. On other issues, including in South Sudan again, the Brits, for example, have taken a bit more of a proactive approach and tried to fill that void. Certainly in areas of Africa like the Sahel, the French continue to have the lead. So there are actors in certain pockets that continue to hold influence, but we constantly hear from regional players that the American lack of policy is a big, big gap. So that continues to hinder
Shireen, your
things.
final thoughts from a human rights perspective. What would you like to see more of and less of here at the UN?
I mean, I think generally we're having a crisis in the human rights community when it comes to this sort of international level. And what we'd really like to see, certainly from the Secretary General, is a much more public statement and leadership. We saw what he's been saying on Myanmar, for example, very recently, and the effect that immediately had, not just on the Security Council, but on actual member states of the UN and how they reacted. So this is a very powerful position. We would like to see him use it to the full.
Shireen Tadros and Ashish Pradhan, thank you both very much. Thank you. So everyone here knows that something has to change. The Security Council, as it stands today, is deeply flawed and undemocratic. 5 powerful countries, the so-called P5, deciding the fate of the rest of the world. In fact, many here are talking about the P3, the US, Russia and China, as the real power brokers. The question is, what kind of change can we really expect without either removing the veto power or bringing in new permanent members? And with the US's decision to cut crucial funding, the new Secretary General is seeing firsthand the limitations of his own authority. Now, of course, the UN has been down this road before and it survived. But unless the other 192 member states and the Secretary General unite to counter these pressures and change the status quo, the United Nations will continue to lose its authority and, more crucially, its moral standing in the world. From the UN headquarters here in New York, from me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team at TRT World, goodbye and thanks for watching.